Here's what I find fascinating. NFL roster building is a big battle between franchises and players. During free agency, representatives of unsigned players are negotiating to get the most money possible, while teams are trying to give them the least amount possible. What you end up with is a roster of guys who all fall somewhere on a scale of being overpaid to underpaid based on their performance. The free agency period is a chance for a team to sign that key player that'll help solidify the team's roster in their pursuit of a championship. But high price tags often spell disaster when the player underperforms. This can collapse any sort of chance a team had to compete. So why don't we go ahead and dive into this video, where we will take a look at the most notable free agents signed in 2024 and find out from the perspective of the teams which of them were the best signings and which were the worst. In 2024, there were 10 notable free agent quarterbacks according to CBS Sports, and although some got decent contracts, one was head and shoulders above the rest. Kirk Cousins and the Falcons agreed to a 4-year, $180 million contract with $100 million guaranteed. The Kirk Cousins signing was surprising, as some sources expected Cousins to return to Minnesota. The big concern here was Cousins suffered an Achilles tear in 2023, one of the worst injuries a player can suffer. Many who suffer this injury are never quite the same athlete they once were. But Cousins could never really move around, so maybe it didn't matter. Plus, he was playing at a high level prior to the injury, so maybe this move was going to be a good investment for the Falcons. After all, this immediately improved their Super Bowl odds, which suggested they would most likely be a playoff team with Cousins. But then, things got weird.
Ladies and gentlemen, the pick is in.
He's right.
The Atlanta Falcons have selected Michael Penix Jr.
It's the sorest of draft thumbs that I've seen in the history of drafts and thumbs.
The Falcons drafted Michael Penix in the first round, just less than 2 months after signing Cousins to that big contract.
Talk about draft night, Kirk Cousins, the Atlanta Falcons picking Michael Penix.
Yeah, I think you're reminded again that there are things you control, and there's a lot of things you don't control.
Unanimously, the football community was shocked by these decisions. But regardless, Cousins was still the starter to begin 2024, with no timetable on when Penix was going to take over. After a bit of a shaky start, Cousins began to make some things happen. He had huge games, including versus Tampa twice and against Dallas. Through 9 games, Cousins was playing pretty solid, trending upwards, and the team was 6-3 and looked like they were the frontrunners to win the division. However, things got ugly fast. A horrible 5-game stretch where Cousins threw 1 touchdown to 9 interceptions left the team in shambles. And that's when they decided to bench Cousins in favor of Penix, which basically ended the Cousins era in Atlanta right then and there, especially after Penix played pretty well. Now, the future for Cousins is uncertain. There's a chance he stays and helps mentor Penix, or the team may trade or release him. Although if they do keep him, $45 million a year for a backup is not great business. For this free agency deal, it's definitely one of the worst of 2024. The only argument you can make that it was worth it was to help develop Penix and show him the ropes. But again, that's a massive price point to have a mentor in the building. Coming in as a distant second behind Cousins, Gardner Minshew agreed to a 2-year, $25 million deal with the Raiders. This was the type of deal you give a bridge quarterback, a guy you think is capable of starting for the short term until you find a better option. Minshew, who sort of established himself as this era's Ryan Fitzpatrick, had tons of success in Indianapolis in 2023, where he nearly led the Colts to the playoffs, and was named a Pro Bowler with an above-average QBR. But in 2024, we saw nothing like that. In fact, things were rough. He played in 9 games, where the team went 2-7, and he threw more interceptions than touchdowns. He was benched at one point during the year, and then in Week 11, he suffered a season-ending broken collarbone. Now, injury aside, this signing hasn't panned out well for the Raiders. What I find fascinating about this is Minshew's performance in Vegas shows us how critical good situations and coaching matters. Minshew proved himself to be a capable low-end starter in this league, but when he entered a dysfunctional situation like what Vegas has, it spelled disaster. It's exactly what happened to Jimmy G a year ago. The rest of the 2024 free agent quarterbacks is a hodgepodge of backups and placeholder starters. At the bottom, one could argue that the Steelers got the most bang for their buck with signing Russell Wilson, getting him on a deal that was worth less than half of what the Bills gave Mitch Trubisky. For that price point, Wilson massively overperformed. He was in the top half of the league in passer rating and helped bring enough to the team to help them reach the playoffs. Although, when you pay this low of a contract for a quarterback, there's usually a good reason. This logic became clear by the end of the season, when Russ proved he was just not the same player he used to be. By the end of the season, the Steelers' offense became extremely limited to basically banking on George Pickens catching go balls, and they were clearly outmatched versus the Ravens in the wild card. Now, easily the most interesting storyline of these quarterbacks, at least to me, is the journey of Sam Darnold. After he signed a one-year bridge quarterback deal with the Vikings, I don't think anyone expected to see what we all witnessed. Darnold looked like an MVP early into the season, and for the most part, continued to play at a high level. Through 16 games, Darnold was clearly on his way to his first Pro Bowl in his most productive season by a mile, and the team was in position to take the #1 seed with a victory in the most anticipated regular season game of the year. The amount of money Darnold could make in 2025 was beyond staggering. But unfortunately, the next 2 games did not go well. Darnold constantly looked rattled, held the ball too long, was inaccurate, and wasn't anticipatory. Honestly, it felt like the Darnold we had all seen most of his career. The Vikings lost both games in large part due to his performance, and it's safe to say he's not the future in Minnesota. But regardless, he massively overperformed in his one-year deal with the Vikings. For the pass catchers, this was a pretty low-key free agency year. Amongst the 8 most notable receiver contracts signed, only one was given wide receiver 1 type of money, which was Calvin Ridley. The Tennessee Titans signed Ridley to a 4-year, $92 million contract, making him their top target in the pass game, and the 16th highest paid receiver in the NFL. Now, unfortunately for the Titans, major issues across the entire offense, primarily at quarterback, led to a disastrous season. They had one of the worst passing offenses in the NFL. But despite these issues, Ridley still had a 1,000-yard season, and overall performed about what his contract was worth. Now, this is a 4-year deal, and Ridley just hit 30, so we will see how these next few years pan out. For the rest of the receivers and tight ends, to give you a sense of how they performed compared to their contracts, I'm going to keep it simple. I will look at where their contract ranks them compared to others at their position, then take their corresponding PFF grades and see how closely aligned those numbers are. Keep in mind, PFF grades aren't everything, but they do give us some sense of how good a player did, since the grades take into account every single play. For the wide receivers, the rest of them were a mixed bag. Some performed to expectations, some didn't, and some got hurt. But most were low-risk propositions anyway. For the tight ends, same type of thing. Noah Fant was the highest paid, and according to his PFF grade, gave slightly below what he was worth. But he did have his most receiving yards he's had as a Seahawk. As a whole, tight ends are one of the lowest paid positions in the NFL, with Travis Kelce earning $17 million per year as the highest paid tight end. This is equivalent to a low-end starting quarterback, the 11th best left tackle, or the 25th best receiver. The unsung heroes in the trenches are often the ones who decide games, which is why the top earners at these positions are paid well. The highest paid defensive lineman of the 2024 offseason was Christian Wilkins, who signed a 4-year, $110 million contract with the Raiders. This made Wilkins the 3rd highest paid interior defensive lineman in the NFL. Unfortunately, he only played in 5 games due to injury. In that short sample, he was great against the run, but had ultimately underperformed. Leonard Williams re-signed with the Seahawks on a 3-year, $21.5 million per year contract, which ranked 11th at his position. And man, did he ball out in 2024. He was the 4th highest graded defensive lineman according to PFF. At one point, he was named NFC Defensive Player of the Month, had 11 sacks, and had that crazy pick 6. Side note, how freakish are some of these NFL players? A 30-year-old who's 6'5", 300 and moves like that? Damn! For the rest of the defensive linemen, here's how they ranked in 2024. Overall, quite a few disappointments. Moving over to the offensive line, guard Robert Hunt signed with the Panthers on a 5-year, $100 million deal, making him tied for the 3rd highest paid guard in the NFL. And in 2024, he was underwhelming. PFF had him graded as the 36th best guard in the NFL. One could argue that his leadership had been an invaluable piece to the Panthers, but his PFF grade had gone down noticeably compared to his 2 seasons in Miami. Mike Onwenu, former 6th round steal for the Patriots, had been an above-average starter throughout his career at both right guard and right tackle. The versatile offensive lineman re-signed with the team on a 3-year, $57 million deal, which ranked 17th amongst all linemen. But 2024 was his worst year as a pro, where he ranked 51st amongst all guards. But it's kind of hard to grade him because he played 1/3 of his snaps at right tackle, the most of any guard in the NFL. So that versatility has to count for something. Overall, here's the rest of the offensive linemen. Once again, you're noticing a theme with these free agents. 6 of the top 8 free agent offensive linemen underperformed according to their PFF grade. The edge rusher is the most coveted defensive position in the modern NFL. And in 2024, Brian Burns, a good, not spectacular player throughout his career, signed with the Giants after a trade to them on a 5-year, $141 million deal, which was the biggest non-quarterback contract of the offseason. This also made him the 3rd highest paid edge rusher in the league. And 2024 was the best graded season of his career. Burns was actually one of the few bright spots on the roster, as he graded out as their 2nd best player and was one of the best pure pass rushers in the NFL, ranking out 12th amongst all edge players. But he was still overpriced based on how much they paid him. I saw this comment from Giants Reddit that said it best: "Good player getting paid like a great player." The next 2 edge rushers were part of a rather interesting situation. Hunter and Greenard basically swapped teams. Hunter went to the Texans and Greenard went to the Vikings. Hunter, the older but more talented player, signed a shorter but higher price per year contract and played at a level that he was worth. Greenard, same thing, as he was one of the most effective pass rushers in the league. For the rest of the edge rushers, you get a mix of guys who underperformed and guys who performed about as expected. Kind of like tight ends, linebackers are a pretty low paid position relative to the rest of the league, with only 1 player making $20 million per year. Patrick Queen was the biggest free agent linebacker signing after the Ravens moved on, and he signed with their rival, the Steelers. As a pass rusher, he was super effective, ranking 7th at the position, but overall, he graded poorly compared to how much he was paid. Outside of rushing the passer and huge games versus his former team and the Browns, Queen was a liability. Azeez Al-Shaair, as another signing to bolster Houston's defense, signed with the Texans on a 3-year, $11.3 million per year contract, which was the 7th highest amongst linebackers. Overall, he was overvalued. He was a solid run defender, but outside of that, he was poor in coverage. His most defining moment was his controversial hit on Trevor Lawrence, and honestly, he got the worst end of that hit, as he was suspended for 3 games and lost $9 million in guarantees. For the rest of the linebackers, we saw a lot of underperformers, with the exception of 1 player.
You know, the first time he got out there at training camp, he was so confident and understood what he needed to do, and he just made plays and had fun.
At the age of 34, the future Hall of Famer is nearing the end of his career. After making a Pro Bowl last year in Seattle, Wagner joined forces with his former D coordinator Dan Quinn, and this season he's been a huge reason to the team's success. Wagner has graded out as the 3rd best linebacker in the NFL, which is just strictly on his play and doesn't take into account his veteran leadership. The more you look into Washington, the more you see why they've been so successful this year. For the defensive backs, it's really been a low-key year, with mostly depth signings outside of safety Xavier McKinney. McKinney signed a 4-year, $68 million contract with the Packers, making him the 5th highest paid at the position. And in 2024, he certainly played to that level, ranking out as the 6th best safety, and was amazing in coverage. For the rest of the safeties, it was a rough year outside of Brandon Jones and how he did with the Broncos. He was spectacular, ranking out as the 5th best safety in 2024. For the corners, this free agency class has been abysmal, with almost all of the top 8 signings underperforming. I had to save the best for last. After years of hearing how running backs have become obsolete and aren't worth paying, the 2024 running back class has restored our faith in the position. Looking at the group as a whole, you will see some underwhelming signings, but as you get closer to the top, you really see the value come into play. Aaron Jones was an awesome addition in Minnesota, finishing with over 1,100 rush yards and played a crucial role in their offensive success. Derrick Henry to the Ravens will go down as one of the best signings in recent memory. Historically, it's a bad idea to invest in a running back who's past the age of 30, but Derrick Henry just is not from this world, and he proved that once again in 2024. He rushed for over 1,900 yards, a league-leading 16 touchdowns on a massive 5.9 yards per carry. The most shocking part of his season was how they didn't get him the ball more in the playoff game versus Buffalo. Of the next 3 backs, the only disappointment here was DeAndre Swift, who ranked out as one of the lowest rated running backs in 2024. Mixon and Jacobs proved to be critical pieces in their new team's offenses. Jacobs had a monster season, rushing for over 1,300 yards, 15 touchdowns, and achieved the 3rd highest PFF grade amongst running backs. Now, finally, we've reached the man on top, Saquon Barkley. After signing a 3-year, $37 million deal with the Eagles, Barkley became the 3rd highest paid back in the NFL. To that point in his career, Barkley had been largely defined by bouts of success, shackled by injuries, and a poor organization around him. No one ever denied how talented he was, and how much potential he had. And ultimately, the Giants decided after 2023 they were only going to bring him back at the right price. From Barkley's perspective, he was fed up with the Giants, calling their approach a little disrespectful. The result? He signed with their rival. And it took all of about 2 seconds for us to realize how big of a mistake the Giants made by letting him go. Over the course of the 2024 season, whether it was numerous breakaway touchdowns or the craziest hurdle we'd ever seen, we watched the legend of Saquon grow. But beyond highlights, after a stunning 255-yard performance versus the Rams, it became very apparent that Saquon could reach the illustrious 2,000-yard rushing season, a feat so rare that it had only happened 8 times in league history. A few weeks later, in Game 16, it happened.
2,003 yards, season high 31 carries for him today. And they're going to take a timeout here just to allow Barkley to get his due from this crowd.
Not only did he reach 2,000 yards, but he didn't need that 17th game to get it, which would have had an asterisk by it considering none of the other guys had a 17th game to reach 2,000 yards. After accomplishing this feat, the Eagles had locked in the 2 seed, and Saquon didn't even play in their final game, a game in which he could have gone for the single season rushing record. For Giants fans, this had to be horrifying to watch. Even when these teams played early in the season, the Eagles destroyed the Giants, and Saquon averaged over 10 yards a carry. What Saquon has done to elevate this team, even in the playoffs, will always be remembered as one of the greatest individual seasons any of us have ever seen.
118 yards and adding to it. There goes Barkley!